This week, we'll give you an update on harvest progress from Rural Reflections East and Rural Reflections West. How are supply chain difficulties affecting farm equipment availability? Old technology from a recent past. And the old Sioux Line Railroad headquarters move south and into history. This is the Rural Reflections Podcast. Welcome to the Rural Reflections Podcast. You've got Dave Nelson in Carrington, North Dakota. Myself, Grant Nelson, here at the studios of Thief River Falls Radio. Dave, we start off with coffee talk, so let's shuck right to the cob. How much rain did you get last week? Nothing. I can't believe that. And I know Governor Doug Burgum has announced an emergency out there or a drought notification or something because it's so bad and you didn't get any rain at all to mediate any of that.
No, I think it was on Thursday or Friday morning. If you went outside, you could smell it. We've seen the clouds off to the south and east of here, but no, we haven't had a thing. And it sounds like we're going to possibly have something Monday and Tuesday, but they're predicting very, very little for that time. Maybe some snow, but...
Now, around here, we've got about 9/10 of an inch, I'd say, on the average in our area. But if you go further west, like over by Warren or so, they only got about 3/10. So far, we've had some people out in the fields. Much of what's going on right now is laying out fertilizer. There is a little bit of seeding that's been going on, but we were talking before we got on the air, and it sounds like out in North Dakota, you've had quite a bit more seeding action going on out there.
Yeah, in this area, the small grains, I think, are largely planted because it's a pretty small amount of what we are going to be planting this year. There was a lot of fall seeding done. There was rye put out last fall and some winter wheat and some dormant seeding of canola and that. Okay. So there's a little bit of other crops seeded, but by and large, I think we're done until they start putting corn in the ground. And there's been a lot of fertilizing done, like you said, and incorporating done and that kind of thing. So they've been active out here, but not really full blast, like it's going to be when corn starts.
Okay. I want to get into old tech, talking about old tech on the farm or in vehicles or whatever, doesn't matter. But before we move to that, it seems like new tech has kind of become a bit of our Achilles heel as far as the supply chain. I've noticed that the car lots are getting a little more empty. I was at a retail business here not too terribly long ago, and some of the toys that depend more on remote control and that sort of thing, I noticed the aisles or the shelves were getting a little bit empty. How is that affecting you out in North Dakota as far as farm equipment and that sort of thing?
Well, there was a mad scramble on in the last couple of weeks to try and order as much as we could because they're talking about allocating only what we have sold in the last year. And our GPS products, they're so slow coming. I've had stuff ordered for a month and a half that hasn't showed up yet. And I don't know, usually a GPS order for us is like a 3-day wait and you get it. So obviously the supply chain is slowing down. The stored up items that they must have had, they must have been used up now. And so we're just waiting for stuff to come from a manufacturer so they can assemble these things now. So it's really slowed it down.
Has it caused anyone to go back to some of the older tech? I mean, let's say like light bars or something like that, or even going back to just the marker that goes out from your drill and just kind of follows along and creates a little furrow that you can follow the next row by.
Well, honestly, the markers and the air drills and stuff, I think the marker has kind of met its demise there because you just can't put a good enough marker on a 60-foot drill or a 70-foot drill. They get extremely heavy when you put them out there. They really are vulnerable. And so I think people will, if they can't have their guidance equipment, they will go and do it by sight, you know. They did it for years like that, and that's what I hear. Well, if I have to, I guess I'll have to turn the steering wheel myself this year, you know.
Well, I remember doing no-till, and sometimes I'd use a GPS light bar, and sometimes I'd just find a fence post on the horizon. And the big thing was never to turn and to just kind of sight it on the end of your tractor and then don't look away, because it seemed the second I looked away, then it would start curving all over the place. So it can be done. It's just a little more difficult. But now we talked a little bit about old technology there, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Let's start off with one of my favorite old tech items, and that'd be the Fender radio. I always think about that 180 Allis-Chalmers that we had back at home, and what a fantastic Fender radio that had.
Yeah, that was a great radio, and it's really funny, the tractor collectors, the ones that are, you know, insane tractor collectors, they are trying their darndest to find the old radios to put inside of those boxes. They're restoring those old radios. They're trying to find the big speaker, and the big speaker was, you know, the big part of that. It was just this enormous speaker for a radio that size, but it really cranked out some noise. So yeah, there's people trying to do that for various reasons. Most of it is probably people that farm with older equipment or the collectors, like I said.
I remember listening to being able to hear the radio, maybe even like a quarter mile away. If somebody was out picking up hay with that Allis-Chalmers, you could hear the radio. You couldn't actually distinguish what was going on, but you could certainly hear it. And I also remember it was so good to haul hay with that, because when you came up to the yard and you started putting bales on the bale elevator, that thing was incredibly loud. It squealed and squeaked. I think that was an old International hay lifter. And that radio, you could play that, and it would climb above all that squealing and squeaking, and you could actually listen to music, and made the work a lot easier. A lot of the other old tech we like to think about, I think about GPS and light bars. I mean, Dave, you started out with light bars probably in the mid-'90s. Is that right?
Yeah. Actually, we had our first GPS meetings when it was starting to be put onto the combines in 1995. And then after that, it just kind of kept on. They added the light bar capability to it. And at that time, we sold that for $59.95. That was an add-on light bar, which was actually an airplane flight bar, but rebranded a little bit. It was airplane equipment that we used. It was just that it was toned down a little bit for the farming part of it. And then we moved into like the early 2000s or 98, 99. It became more something made for agriculture, for tractors and so on, more easily mounted and so on. And then it just pretty much kept on growing from that, where everything has a display in it. Everything has steering in it. And sometimes, you know, the older stuff wasn't really built for it, but everything comes built for it now that steers and drives up and down the field. The combines, the swathers, the tractors, all of it. You know, well, we've moved to now to the point where our stuff is becoming obsoleted, and there's new versions of it coming, and there's touch screens instead of buttons, and it kind of just keeps on going, you know. And right now we're at the point of AFS Connect, RTK, RTK, and it's so that the owner can watch his equipment, they can diagnose it, we can upload software into a machine while it's working in the field.
It's like fantasy farming meets real farming. You know, the one bit of old tech I don't miss so much, but occasionally get to use our forks. Now we have like your silage fork. Of course, we were very familiar with that on the farm because we pitched a lot of silage. That must have had 10 tines or something like that. And then you had your manure fork, which was probably, I believe, a 4 tine. And then the 3 tine would have been the hay fork. But, I don't know that we ever used a lot of 3 tines. I think we usually just used that 4 tine for the hay pitching too. Don't you think, Dave?
Yeah, Dad used to never think you could get enough hay on a 3 tine, so we pretty much always had 4 tines. There would be a 3 tine fork or two around, but that was for the kids when they were learning how to use one.
Those are training wheel forks. That's all those were. This talk about forks has made my back tired. Let's take a break, Dave. When we come back, we're going to talk about a railroad that you and I both are very familiar with and has, for the most part, kind of passed into history. Let's take a break. We'll be right back on the Rural Reflections Podcast. Welcome back to the Rural Reflections Podcast. Last Sunday, the Canadian Pacific Railway announced that it had purchased the Kansas City Southern Railway. Now, the Canadian Pacific purchased the Soo Line way back when, and of course the Soo Line got everything underway way back in the 1880s and really has been part of Minnesota for 120 years, including the use of their office in Minneapolis for Canadian Pacific. Now, after this purchase by Canadian Pacific of the Kansas City Southern Railway, they moved their office down to Kansas City, Missouri, effectively ending that 120-year history of Soo Line in Minnesota. And of course, what's going on there is they want to have a railroad that can go from Canada to the United States to Mexico without having to stop. And they'll be able to use that USMCA a little bit more easily that way. But it goes a little bit deeper than that for us, Dave. I mean, the Soo Line Railroad was always kind of a big part of Viking, Minnesota, our old hometown, wasn't it?
Yeah, it sure was. It was always kind of mysterious to have the train there, and I remember the depot. I remember actually cream cans and the little carts outside the depot. I remember some of the kids and the depot agents that lived there. So I've seen a lot of Soo Line, and it's been everywhere I've been practically. I moved to Fordville. Soo Line came right through there. The wheat line went through there. I married a gal that Dad was a foreman on the Soo Line, and he also worked for CP later. But it's been a big part of everywhere I've been in North Dakota and in Minnesota too.
Yeah, a big part of it. They worried the Sault Ste. Marie Railroad is what it was first called in 1880, but they were worrying that the big Great Northern Railroad was going to make things so expensive for the millers to get their product anywhere, and that's where the Soo Line came about. They wanted to have some kind of competition so they could get things out without having to use that Great Northern. James J. Hill, of course, put that back together way back when. And the Soo Line was a big part of farming. I mean, that's how we got our grain moved around, and that's how we actually even got things on the railroad that nowadays, a lot of times we get them from a truck or something like that, don't we?
Yes, actually, the guy I worked for in Fordville was kind of an all-purpose entrepreneur. He used to have a cattle yard right in Fordville, and he would trade cattle for machinery and ship cattle out of Fordville. And that was all done on train at the time. And so there's, a lot of things that Soo Line did for these parts that helped it to grow and become what it is.
Back in 2005, I interviewed several people around Viking. It was for a sesquicentennial. Can't remember what it was. A big celebration in Viking anyway. So I wanted to interview several people. And a lot of them talked about the train. And one thing that they did was cut wild grass and load it into the train, and they'd send it off for people's horses in other parts of Minnesota. It was apparently a pretty good product for horses, so they used the train for that. And then also some of them spoke about not being able to really get anywhere in the springtime because the roads were so bad, but you always had the train to get somewhere. And the train being a people mover, with the exception of Amtrak, I mean, we don't really think about that much anymore as far as the train being a people mover. At least I don't, Dave.
No, it was, there was always the passenger car on the train along with the rest of it. But I know I've heard people say, they get on in Viking and they go to Cedar Falls, or they get on in Radium, or they get on wherever, Warren, and go back and forth like that. Crazy that you would be beholding to a train to get to a dentist appointment or a doctor appointment or something like that.
Kind of crazy to think about. It holds a big place, though. Recently, I found a picture at one of our antique stores here in Thief River Falls, and it had several different Soo Line trains, the engines themselves. They were parked on a siding, and I thought, that is the most beautiful picture. And that's hanging up in my studio upstairs at home. And that's the one thing about the Soo Line trains, that color combination, the red, the white, and the black. I mean, has there ever been a prettier looking engine?
No, I don't think so. I mean, and they really were coming into decorating them nicely towards the end of the Soo Line. There was a lot of good looking stuff that the CP picked up and still used for a while. We still see Soo Line cars occasionally, but it's not so much now. The engines have all changed. I'm sure they've gone up in horsepower and all that again, and so there's not so many of them around. But it's fun to see a Soo Line car every now and then.
Yeah, and you're right. Soo Line tradition, the good-looking unit trains that they had, or the good-looking units that were trains, not unit trains, did carry on Canadian Pacific, even with the holiday train. When we get the holiday train around here, and I know the holiday train comes out to Carrington too, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And what a pretty train and what a nice experience that's always been. Of course, with COVID this last year, we didn't get to do that. But when you see that train all decorated for Christmas coming down the tracks, and then they stop and they do a little singing and gets everybody together. And also, it's usually a good benefit for usually a food shelf or something like that. It all kind of comes back down together. So it's a nice tradition. I guess, though, the tradition of the Soo Line in Minnesota has kind of come to a halt. I know during my news story I put in that the Soo Line now not only does not have a caboose, it really has no home anymore, which I thought was kind of sad. But it'll always be in our memories, right?
Yep. I won't forget it.
No, I won't either. Dave, you got anything else for us this week?
Well, it's kind of the same thing as always. We're praying for rain and appreciating the nice weather that we have. It's just too bad we don't get a little bit of moisture.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you'll get some this week and wet up all that grain that your farmers already have in the ground. Dave, you have a great week, okay?
All right, you too, Grant. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. There he is, my brother Dave Nelson in Carrington, North Dakota. I'm Grant Nelson here at the studios of Thief River Falls Radio, and this is the Rural Reflections Podcast.